You know, it feels like you can't go online these days without someone offering a take on modern boys. And often, particularly when we're talking about white boys, that take feels, well, pretty negative.
Yeah, like there's some kind of problem to be solved.
Exactly. And that's precisely where we're diving in today, spurred by some really thought-provoking content from the YouTube channel Echo Chamberlain.
What's truly compelling is the core question they pose, something I know you've probably considered yourself.
Yeah.
Beyond the sensational headlines and the moral outrage, what's actually going on with this group?
Right. What are the real underlying currents shaping their experiences? Exactly. We're not about just skimming the surface. We've really dug into the transcript of one of their videos to unpack the key factors that contribute to the challenges and, frankly, the perceptions surrounding modern boys.
So think of this as your shortcut to understanding what's truly happening beneath all the noise.
A crucial starting point, it seems, is how the media chooses to depict these young men.
Definitely. The way stories are framed often sets the stage for broader societal conversations, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The video transcript brings up the Netflix show Adolescence as a really interesting case study. On the surface, it ticks some relevant boxes: the potential dangers of the internet for young people, the serious issue of knife crime.
But the way it pieces these elements together, according to our source, is where the trouble begins.
What's fascinating here, and I think you'll find this particularly insightful, is the argument that the show essentially borrows issues that might be more prevalent in other communities and then unfairly projects them onto white middle-class boys.
Right. This narrative of a seemingly normal kid from a stable background suddenly becoming a murderer because of online influences. Well, it isn't really supported by the data on crime, is it?
Not according to this analysis. The transcript makes a strong point that there's no real evidence to suggest that watching certain kinds of online content would automatically transform a boy with a solid foundation into a violent criminal.
Instead, it argues this kind of portrayal fuels a moral panic, especially among parents, and ends up reinforcing negative stereotypes about an entire demographic of young people.
And the upshot of this, as the video astutely points out, is that these boys can start to feel unfairly judged simply for who they are, not for anything they've actually done.
Yeah, it fosters this underlying sense of being constantly looked down upon or even blamed by the adults around them.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit more, because the video then delves into what it sees as a really fundamental ideological force shaping these negative portrayals: social constructivism.
Ah, yes.
Now, for those of you who might not be as familiar with the term, what's the core idea behind it?
In essence, social constructivism, as the transcript explains it, is the belief that gender is almost entirely a product of social learning and cultural norms.
Right. The idea is that there aren't really inherent differences in how boys and girls are inclined to behave. Instead, we learn to perform these roles based on the scripts society gives us.
Like learning to play a part in a play, sort of.
But the video we're looking at takes a pretty strong stance against this, calling it a toxic ideology. Why such a strong reaction?
Well, the central argument is that this perspective has really skewed our understanding of gender, particularly when it comes to men. The transcript even points to the example of Scandinavian countries.
Oh, yeah. What happened there?
You might expect that a strong push for social constructivist ideas would lead to more gender sameness, but ironically, they actually saw a greater divergence in certain gendered behaviors.
Wow, the opposite of the intended effect.
Exactly.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because the transcript then tackles the term toxic masculinity. How has social constructivism, in their view, kind of twisted the understanding of this concept?
Well, the initial understanding of toxic masculinity often implied that there's a healthy form of masculinity that can become distorted into something harmful.
Right. It's like a corruption of something actually good.
Precisely. But the argument here is that social constructivism has, in many ways, broadened it to suggest that all traditional masculine traits are essentially artificial and inherently negative.
So things seen as patronizing, diminishing,
and ultimately disorienting for young men.
Yeah. So it's this real contradiction, isn't it? On one hand, boys are told that their identity isn't something inherent, it's just a social performance. But then on the other hand, media like Adolescence kind of implies they're somehow inherently dangerous or prone to negative behaviors.
It's a real double bind for them, isn't it?
Definitely.
And the video makes a crucial point that I think will resonate. While Culture definitely plays a role in shaping how boys behave, and they certainly face societal pressures to be tough and, emotionally detached.
Sure, those pressures are real.
The idea that they need to reject their masculinity entirely in order to thrive is presented as simply wrong. In fact, for many boys, fully embracing their masculinity in a healthy way is how they flourish.
The transcript also highlights the kind of constant messaging boys are exposed to, this idea that their gender is somehow in decline.
Right.
Still unfairly privileged in some ways, and responsible for a whole range of societal problems. It paints a pretty disheartening picture.
What's fascinating here is the suggestion that young men might be picking up on this pervasive negative view of them, this almost constant snide and chiding attitude from wider society.
Yeah.
And making a conscious or unconscious choice to simply disengage.
Why bother? Why actively participate in a culture that seems to view you with suspicion or disdain?
Exactly. And the video really emphasizes the potential power of this disengagement, this leverage that young men have. When they decide to opt out, they take their energy, their unique perspectives, and their potential contributions with them.
It's not a neutral act. There are real consequences.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the transcript raises a really thought-provoking question. What if these young men don't actually feel like they're missing out on much by disengaging? What if their sense of unease and lack of motivation is actually a reflection of a broader cultural stagnation or a lack of compelling alternative?
That's a challenging but important idea to grapple with. It really is.
Yeah.
Now, shifting gears quite significantly, the transcript then delves into what it calls one of the most profound societal failures of the 21st century when it comes to boys: the widespread availability and accessibility of pornography.
This is a critical point, and the video argues that while the established concerns about the link between pornography and misogyny are valid,
of course,
the discussion has often been too narrowly focused. They want to explore the deeper psychological, social, and even philosophical impact this is having on the development of male adolescent identity and desire.
Okay, so beyond the more commonly discussed concerns, what are some of the more nuanced ways that early and constant exposure to pornography can affect young boys, according to the transcript?
Well, the transcript outlines several really key areas that I think are insightful. Firstly, they discuss erotic exhaustion.
Erotic exhaustion, meaning?
Think of it this way. The constant barrage of hypernovelty and extreme stimulation in porn can essentially raise the bar so high that real-life intimacy can feel, underwhelming to young boys.
Right. Desensitization.
Exactly. Secondly, there's the kinkification of desire, where their preferences become driven by the need for increasingly extreme and novel content rather than developing from their own natural temperament and emotional connection.
So it's driven by the algorithm almost, not by them.
In a way, yeah. And thirdly, fantasy detachment, where their internal templates for what arousal and sexual interaction look like become misaligned with the realities of human connection and relationships.
So it's not just about the specific acts they're viewing,
No.
but more about how that constant viewing is fundamentally shaping their understanding of sex and intimacy at a really formative stage.
Exactly. The video emphasizes how this can rewire their arousal patterns around concepts of control, distance, and that always available frictionless satisfaction that pornography offers.
Right. If their primary sexual experiences are all happening in this isolated fantasy world,
it can fundamentally alter their expectations and their capacity for vulnerability and genuine connection in real relationships later on.
And the transcript brings up a really unsettling point about the intersection of pornography, young teen boys, and the pervasive influence of social media. How do those connect?
What's particularly concerning, and I think the logic here is clear, is how social media blurs the already fuzzy lines between fantasy and reality for these young boys.
Okay.
The object of their interest can often be a peer whose social media profiles are readily accessible. Their images can be easily magnified, edited, even incorporated into their consumption of pornographic material.
Wow, that's deeply problematic.
It creates really complex issues around shame and voyeurism because it's no longer an impersonal act. It can feel directed at someone they actually know and interact with in their daily lives.
So there's this constant potential for exposure, for being labeled as a creep or an objectifier. It creates a whole new level of social anxiety around these.
Precisely. And the video argues that for some boys, pornography can become a kind of refuge, a predictable and seemingly safe space compared to the often messy and uncertain world of real-life relationships.
Yeah, why risk rejection, awkwardness, or the fear of misinterpreting boundaries when you have this low-risk, high-reward simulation constantly available?
Exactly. But the cost, as the transcript points out, can be really significant.
Like what?
Stunted emotional development, a delay in forming healthy relationships, feelings of loneliness and isolation, and a real confusion about their own genuine desires versus what they're constantly seeing online.
It sounds like it contributes to what the video terms a crisis of initiation.
A breakdown of the traditional structures and rituals that historically helped boys navigate that complex transition into manhood through real-world experiences and embodied social learning.
Now, the discussion pivots to a really important and often overlooked distinction, the difference between sexual assertiveness and sexual aggression in young men.
Yes, this is crucial.
This seems like a nuance that often gets lost in broader conversation.
Absolutely. The transcript argues that the narratives surrounding young men and their sexuality often fail to grasp the inherent complexities of their desire. On one hand, they're bombarded with hypersexualized content.
Right.
Yet on the other hand, their understanding of healthy and consensual sexual expression is often underdeveloped.
So how does the video specifically define the difference between aggression and assertiveness in a sexual context? Because I think that clarity is really key here.
Okay, so aggression in this context is quite simply defined as behavior that disregards consent. Full stop.
Okay. Clear enough.
Assertiveness, on the other hand, absolutely requires consent. It's about a young man feeling confident and able to initiate within a shared understanding of respect and mutuality.
So it's about being bold, maybe, but within an agreed-upon framework.
Exactly. And the core argument here is that a societal fear of even acknowledging or validating healthy male sexual assertiveness has led to a kind of flattening of these really complex interpersonal dynamics.
Just lumping it all together as potentially problematic.
Pretty much. And what's the positive impact when a young man feels he can confidently navigate these kinds of interactions, according to the transcript?
Well, when a young man feels secure in his ability to understand and respect boundaries, when he feels he can confidently meet the terms of an encounter rather than trying to dominate or dictate it, something really positive unlocks. He develops a more secure sense of his own sexuality. And this more grounded understanding can actually make the social and emotional aspects of relationships much easier to navigate. He becomes more self-assured, perhaps even more relaxed and considerate.
That makes sense.
The transcript even goes so far as to call sexual success a kind of rite of passage for many boys.
Wow.
A fundamental act of self-affirmation and individuation. So when that passage is somehow blocked or denied, what are the potential negative consequences?
Well, when boys are denied this clarifying passage, whether it's through social anxieties fueled by online comparisons, withdrawal due to porn, or fear of crossing unclear boundaries, they often don't just remain neutral. They can sometimes drift into more negative behaviors as a way of acting out, or they might simply opt out of romantic and sexual relationships altogether,
leading to isolation and a sense of disconnection.
Right.
It's interesting how the transcript highlights this societal taboo around even acknowledging assertive masculine sexuality.
Yeah, the lack of positive language.
Exactly. It feels like all we have are cautionary tales and pathologizing terms.
And this is all happening against a backdrop of some pretty significant shifts in sexual behavior. The video points to a declining age of first sexual encounter, alongside a somewhat surprising increase in sexual inactivity among young men.
Really, inactivity is increasing.
At least according to the statistics cited in the U.S. for certain age groups, It suggests a real disconnect between the constant sexualization in media and the actual experiences of young men.
It really does feel like the transcript is calling for a kind of cultural reckoning, an acknowledgement that it's a healthy part of development for boys to become sexually confident and able to initiate within respectful boundaries.
Without that immediately being framed through a negative or suspicious ideological lens.
Exactly.
The absence of a healthy language and a supportive framework around this aspect of male development is presented as a significant societal failing that we need to address.
Absolutely.
The conversation then moves to the role of female educators and therapists in boys' lives, noting their significant presence in these professions. What's the specific concern being raised?
The transcript highlights the statistically disproportionate number of female school counselors and teachers, citing figures from both the U.S. and the U.K.
Okay.
Now, this isn't presented as inherently negative, but the video points to research suggesting that boys often express a preference for male counselors when dealing with personal or social issues.
Interesting. And the video also raises the potential for unexamined biases to play a role.
Yes. The argument is that unexamined stereotypes or preconceived notions held by some female therapists could inadvertently create environments that feel invalidating or even subtly hostile to young men.
Making it harder to build trust. Exactly. Hindering the therapeutic process, potentially.
The transcript suggests the potential benefits of male-friendly therapeutic approach. What might those look like?
Well, these might involve incorporating activities or topics that resonate more with young men's interests, maybe fostering a non-judgmental action-oriented atmosphere, being mindful of communication styles.
Right.
The idea of striving for a better gender balance among counselors is also suggested, although the transcript acknowledges that there might be resistance to openly discussing any potential drawbacks of female dominance in these roles.
Gotcha. The concept of androgyny also comes under scrutiny in the transcript. It draws a contrast between past and present interpretations.
Yeah, this is interesting. The video makes a distinction between what they call the cool androgyny of past cultural icons, think Bowie, Jagger, Lou Reed.
Right, very iconic.
Which often felt subversive, playful, even carried a strong sexual undercurrent. And they contrast that with the more contemporary version they dub pussyish androgyny.
Ooh, strong words.
Which they argue has largely lost those key elements of subversion and sexual intrigue.
So the playful, boundary-pushing, and often sexually charged aspects have been replaced by something less compelling, more homogenous.
That's the argument, that this shift has led to what they see as rather vapid and ultimately unrelatable male archetypes in mainstream entertainment. The transcript even critiques progressive observers who tend to focus solely on issues of male dominance in industries without actually evaluating whether the men in those prominent positions have any genuine appeal or resonance with mainstream young men.
They even use specific examples, like the showrunners of certain recent fantasy franchises and characters in Star Trek and Star Wars.
Yeah, illustrating men who many young guys might perceive as lightweight or even, quote, lame. Pretty direct critique.
It is.
What's fascinating here is the underlying point. Simply having men in positions of influence isn't the only factor. The kind of men being elevated, their perceived characteristics, their appeal, that also plays a significant role.
Makes sense. The discussion then takes an interesting turn towards the perceived decline of mainstream popular music.
The modern music is garbage.
Pretty much. The transcript makes that rather bold assertion compared to past generations.
That's a strong statement. And the video explores a potential, albeit speculative, link between this perceived decline in musical quality and the broader disengagement of young men.
How so? They delve into differences in musical preferences, right?
Yeah, broadly speaking, the analysis suggests that men often have a slightly greater inclination toward the technical and instrumental aspects of music.
The things aspect, like technology or processes.
Exactly. And an appreciation for the collaborative dynamic of band. Women, on the other hand, may tend to focus more on the emotional relatability of lyric and the personal narratives conveyed by solo artists, the people aspect.
Okay, that aligns with some common observation. They contrast bands like the Beatles or Nirvana
with their emphasis on musicianship and band dynamic,
with current solo artists like Taylor Swift, where the focus often seems more on lyrics and emotional connection.
Right. And they point to the rather dramatic decrease in the number of actual bands appearing in the Billboard Top 100 chart as tangible evidence of this shift.
Fewer bands, more solo acts?
Seems that way. The video also touches upon the historical significance of male competitiveness as a driving force behind musical innovation.
How has that changed?
Historically, that element of rivalry, early blues pianists, 60s band rivalries, 80s rap battles served as a powerful catalyst for honing skills and pushing creative boundaries.
Right, that competitive edge.
The argument is that contemporary music, maybe with its greater emphasis on individual expression and less on that direct competitive dynamic, might be missing that crucial spark.
So the suggestion is that the relative lack of compelling, boundary-pushing, perhaps even a little brash, young men in the current mainstream music scene might be contributing to this perceived decline.
That's the provocative suggestion they put forward, at least from a certain perspective.
Another really interesting point the transcript raises is the growing cynicism towards male cultural spaces.
Yes, the push for female representation everywhere.
Even in traditionally male-dominated areas like gaming. What's the perspective offered here?
The transcript highlights a prevailing attitude that maybe cultural spaces primarily enjoyed by boys are somehow inherently problematic or a sign of privilege.
Right.
Leading to increasing calls for female representation. The video cites examples of attempts to inject identity politics into traditionally male-centric areas like gaming or franchises like Star Wars and Marvel.
Often with a pretty lukewarm reception from the existing audience, right?
Often, yes. And the fundamental question being posed, it seems, is whether boys are even allowed to have cultural spaces that are primarily for them, without those spaces being immediately viewed with suspicion or as something needing to be fixed.
Tough question.
It is. The transcript suggests that the rise of short-form video platforms and long-form content on YouTube might be partially filling this void.
Providing a space.
offering young men a space for escapism and maybe a break from what they rather bluntly term nagging pre-ish bullshit.
Okay. Finally, the discussion in the transcript turns to the declining number of young men choosing to pursue studies in the humanities.
Another trend we hear a lot about.
But the transcript challenges the typical framing of this issue. How so?
Instead of just viewing this decline as a deficit within young men, like they're not interested in intellectual pursuits or they only want practical fields.
Yeah.
The transcript suggests that many young men may simply not perceive contemporary humanities as being particularly serious or intellectually rigorous anymore.
What's led to that perception? What's turned them away?
Well, the argument is that for some intellectually curious young men, the contemporary humanities can increasingly look less like a genuine space for open inquiry and more like a theater of moral sorting, where certain conclusions are often predetermined and ideological conformity is subtly encouraged. The classroom environment, in some cases, can feel like your identity matters more than your arguments.
The transcript specifically mentions the increasingly didactic atmosphere in fields like English and culture.
Yeah, meaning overly instructive, prescriptive, often with a clear moral or ideological agenda. Like the correct view is already decided. Less room for real debate.
Which can be unappealing if you're genuinely curious.
Very unappealing.
And where are these intellectually curious young men turning instead, if not to traditional humanities departments?
The video points to the rise of independent online creators, YouTube essayists, long-form podcasts, platforms like Substack.
Ah, the shadow university.
Exactly, where they're finding content they perceive as more engaging, intellectually honest, and maybe less overtly ideologically driven.
The transcript concludes by revisiting the ongoing discourse surrounding controversial figures like Andrew Tate and the broader manosphere.
Right, bringing it back around.
Arguing that while these are topics of discussion, they're not necessarily the primary drivers of disaffection for many white boys.
What does the video suggest is the deeper cause then?
It posits that the attraction to figures like Tate is, in part, a symptom rather than the root cause, maybe a phase or a byproduct of that social constructivist messaging we discussed, coupled with the impact of porn, social media, and just a general disengagement from a mainstream culture they find uninspired or even hostile.
They draw a distinction between boys simply giving up and boys actively turning their back on society.
Right. A conscious choice, almost. So the core takeaway is that many boys feel disconnected due to a complex mix of media influences, tech impact, and prevailing ideological attitudes.
And while important conversations about boys are definitely needed,
the current approach, often driven by what they term pre-ish grown-ups, might actually be hindering real progress.
Precisely. These are complex issues, no easy answer. But the video concludes we need to move beyond simplistic explanations.
So to bring our deep dive to a close today, we've journeyed through the argument that the often negative, simplistic narratives around modern boys, particularly white boys, really fail to grasp the complex underlying factor.
We've considered the potential downsides of certain takes on social constructivism, the huge, often underestimated impact of pornography,
the crucial need to distinguish between healthy sexual assertiveness and harmful aggression,
the shifting landscape of culture in music and androgyny, and some potential reasons behind the increasing disengagement of young men from various spheres, including academia.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, the listener. Consider the ways, maybe subtle ways, our broader societal conversations and cultural outputs might be inadvertently contributing to the varied challenges we claim to be addressing.
What if a more effective path forward lies not in constant critique and pathologizing, but in cultivating a more nuanced, perhaps more empathetic understanding of their lived experiences and needs?
Something to reflect on. We encourage you to take some time, think about your own assumptions, and maybe seek out diverse perspectives on this incredibly complex and vitally important topic.